The bridge is half a river wide and growing. From 1100 meters, the fixed-wing camera holds a steady orbit, and the picture it sends back is almost calm. Gray water, a dark ribbon of metal reaching out from the far bank, and along it small figures moving with the deliberate speed of men who know exactly how exposed they are. A bridging boat noses a fresh section into the gap. Another float clicks home. The span lengthens by 6.5 meters. Somewhere a clock no one can see is already running. The only question that matters now is how long the structure can sit on open water before someone finishes reading it. Reorientation underscore checkpoint 030 hook resolution tease. Here is the thing about a pontoon bridge. It is not just a way across a river, it is a confession. Every float that touches the water tells you something about the men who carried it, the trucks that brought it, and the kind of weight it was built to bear. In this investigation, we are not going to watch a battle. We are going to do something quieter and more revealing. We are going to take overhead reconnaissance footage of a Russian pontoon span being assembled and read it the way a military engineer would, float by float, ribbon by ribbon, until the structure itself tells us roughly who built it and what they meant to send across. This is the Seversky Donets country, or terrain very much like it, the slow, brown, unspectacular waterways of eastern Ukraine that have decided more of this war than any single city. Rivers do not look like obstacles on a map, they look like blue lines. But to an army moving armor, a river is a wall, and the only doors through that wall are the bridges. And when the standing bridges are blown, an army has to build its own. That is the most dangerous thing a modern military can attempt, and everyone planning a crossing knows it before the first truck rolls forward. To understand why the men on that footage move the way they do, you have to understand what happened roughly 4 years before, a short drive north, at a place called Bilohorivka. In the second week of May 2022, Russian forces tried to push a battalion tactical group across the Seversky Donets near that village. They brought a pontoon park, they laid a bridge, and they began pushing armor across. Ukrainian artillery had the river zeroed. Over a span of days, the crossing site became one of the most photographed disasters of the entire war. Open-source analysts at Oryx, working purely from imagery, cataloged the wreckage. Dozens of vehicles, the burned remains of the bridging equipment, armor abandoned nose down in the shallows. The published tallies ran to roughly 70 vehicles destroyed or abandoned, the equivalent of a reinforced battalion's worth of combat power, gone at a single river bend. No independent body has ever produced one clean, agreed casualty figure, and we will not pretend one exists. But the equipment losses were visible from space, and the lesson was unambiguous. That lesson is the reason a clock starts the moment the first float hits the water. A pontoon bridge cannot hide. It is long, it is straight, it is metallic, and it sits on the one flat surface in the landscape that reflects radar and shows up cold against warm ground and thermal. The men assembling it cannot dig in, they cannot disperse, they are standing on a target, they are building larger by the minute. Retention underscore checkpoint, 4 o'clock stakes bend. The bridge is a target that grows down. So how do you read a bridge you have never touched, in a country you cannot reach, from footage shot by a drone that never landed? You start with the hardware, because Russian engineer doctrine is standardized, and standardized things can be counted. The system most likely on that water belongs to one of two families. The older is the PMP, the Pontoon Bridge Park, a Soviet design that has been in service since the 1960s and remains in heavy use. A full PMP set carries 32 river links and 4 shore links, each river link folding out from the back of a truck and unfolding on the water into a flat roadway section. Link to link, those sections clip together into a ribbon. Bring the ribbons together and you have either a continuous floating bridge or a set of self-propelled rafts. The numbers matter, so hold on to them. A complete PMP set can throw a bridge of roughly 227 meters rated for a 60-ton load, or stretch to around 380 meters if you accept a lighter 20-ton class. The newer family is the PP2005 and its modernized variant, the PP2005M, mounted on the KAMAZ 63501 chassis. Built to carry the heavier modern main battle tanks across at load classes the older park was never designed for. Here is where the counting begins, and here is the first thing the footage gives you for free. Each standard river link is about 6 3/4 meters long once it unfolds. That is the ruler. If you can count the floats in a completed span, and from a steady overhead orbit you multiply by that link length and you have the river's width at that point to within a few meters without ever consulting a map. The bridge measures the river for you. I spent a long time going frame by frame through this kind of footage, and one detail kept nagging at me. It was not the bridge, it was the boats. Retention underscore checkpoint, personal phrase #1, research angle. A pontoon bridge does not assemble itself. The folded links are dropped into the water, and then shoved, turned, and locked into the growing ribbon by bridging boats, small powerful pusher craft. With the PMP, that work is done by boats in the BMK family. With the PP2005 system, the modern partner is the BMK 225. Count the boats working the span, and you are no longer counting metal, you are counting capacity. 2 boats laying a span is a small detachment moving carefully. 5 or 6 boats working in coordinated pairs is a full engineer effort, with the manpower and the truck column to match. The boats are the tell that the floats alone can never give you, because the boats reveal not what was built, but how many hands were available to build it. The footage runs 4 minutes and 19 seconds in its longest continuous segment, and across that window the analyst is doing 3 things at once: counting floats to get length and load class, counting boats to bracket the size of the detachment, and, most important of all, timing. The single most valuable number a pontoon crossing can give an investigator is not how big it is how long it took to build, and therefore how long it had to sit there, finished and exposed, before the first vehicle could cross. The investigation hit its first wall right there, in the timing. The trouble is that reconnaissance footage is almost never continuous. Drones orbit, they break station, they return. The footage we are reading is stitched from at least 3 separate passes, and between the passes there are gaps, minutes, sometimes longer, where the camera simply was not looking. You can see the span at 12 floats in one pass and 20 in the next, but you cannot see the 8 floats laid in between, and you cannot prove how long that took. An assembly timeline with holes in it is not a timeline, it is a guess wearing a stopwatch. The way investigators close that gap is unglamorous, and it works. You anchor the timeline to things in the frame that you can independently date. Shadow angle gives you a rough local time of day, surface conditions, the chop on the water, the haze, narrow the window. And where overhead commercial imagery exists, a single satellite pass from a provider like Planet Labs, catching the same river on the same day, can pin one end of the timeline to a hard timestamp. The footage tells you the sequence, the satellite tells you the clock. Put them together and the holes shrink from "we have no idea" to "this span was assembled across roughly a 2 to 3 hour build window." Not certainty, but a bracket you can defend. The investigation could move forward. What the analyst did not yet know was that the most revealing object in the entire feed was not the bridge at all. It was a single float near the eastern bank that refused to behave like the others. Ryachian_checkpoint microfinal #1, the float that won't behave. Hold that float in mind, we will come back to it, because it is the kind of small, wrong detail that ends up carrying the whole argument. First, the strategic frame, because counting floats means nothing if you do not understand why anyone would risk this at all. A standing bridge that an army can drive across in seconds is worth almost any price. When the permanent bridges are dropped, and in this war they are dropped early and often, by both sides, armor stops at the water's edge. Infantry can cross in boats, armor cannot. And without armor, an offensive on the far bank is a man with a rifle hoping the enemy ran out of artillery first. So the pontoon bridge is not a luxury. It is the difference between an offensive and a wish, which is exactly why the other side watches the rivers the way a hawk watches a hedgerow. What gets us about this problem is how little has actually changed, and how completely the balance has shifted anyway. The PMP system is 60 years old. The doctrine for laying it is older still. The river has not moved. But the thing watching the river has changed beyond recognition. A cheap fixed-wing drone, loitering at altitude, feeding a live picture to an artillery cell that can read a bridge faster than the bridge can be built. The crossing has not gotten harder, the watching has gotten better. That asymmetry is what has made the open river crossing one of the most punishing gambles on the modern battlefield. Retention_checkpoint, authorial opinion, what the case reveals about the era. Now the floats themselves. On the footage, the completed sections show as a repeating pattern, flat, dark roadway panels with a regular seam every 6 3/4 meters where one link meets the next. An experienced eye does not count one float at a time. It counts the seams because the seams are sharper than the panels and each seam is a link boundary. Count seams, add 1 and you have your float count. On this span, the count comes to roughly 33 river links bridging the gap, with the shore links anchoring each end. 33 links multiplied out gives a wet gap on the order of 220 meters, a substantial river, and very close to the upper limit of what a single PMP set can bridge at the heavier load class. That number does 2 things at once. It tells you the river is wide enough to demand essentially the entire pontoon park, with no spare capacity, no second set held in reserve. And it tells you something about intent. A span built right up against the heavy load rating is not a span built to walk infantry across. It is a span built to carry tanks. The bridge is announcing, in the only language it has, that armor was meant to cross. Most people assume the danger to a pontoon bridge is the bridge itself, that the engineers blow up when the bridge does. The evidence tells a different and grimmer story. The most dangerous moment is not the crossing, it is the assembly. During assembly, the structure is finished enough to be an obvious target but not yet finished enough to be useful, and the men are concentrated on it with nowhere to go. At Bilohorivka, the killing window was not when armor was rolling across. It was the long, exposed stretch before and during, when the crossing site was crowded and static and the artillery had time to walk its fire in. The bridge is most lethal to its own builders in the hours when it is least useful to anyone else. Which brings us back to that misbehaving float near the eastern bank. Retention underscore checkpoint tilde 50% mid-roll hook, the anomalous float reframed. In the second pass, with the span already well advanced, one section near the home bank is sitting at the wrong angle. The other links lie flat and square to the current. This one is canted, nose slightly out of line, and a single bridging boat is holding station against it rather than moving on to extend the span. To a casual eye, it is nothing, a section being adjusted, but to an engineer it is a story. A canted section under a holding boat this late in the build almost always means a coupling that would not seat, a connection between two links that failed to lock, forcing the crew to work it by hand against the current while the rest of the bridge waited. That is not a detail. That is lost time stamped into the footage, and lost time on a pontoon bridge is the only currency that matters. Here is the part that does not make sense on the surface. A failed coupling is a routine problem. Engineers train for it. It should not change anything. And yet it changes everything because of where it happened in the sequence. The fault is near the home bank, which means it occurred late, after most of the span was already laid and already visible from the air for the better part of a build window. Every minute that boat spends wrestling that one stubborn section is a minute the entire finished bridge sits complete and unused, advertising itself to anything watching. The bridge was in effect finished and waiting on a single bad joint. That is the worst possible failure mode. Not a bridge that collapses, but a bridge that works perfectly and simply cannot open on time. Put yourself on that boat for a second. It is the early afternoon. The haze is thin. You can feel that you are being watched even if you cannot see by what. The span behind you is done, and the only thing between you and getting armor across is one coupling that will not seat. Every man on the water knows the arithmetic. The longer this takes, the worse the odds. And there is nothing to do but keep working the joint. So how long did it sit? Here is the honest answer, and it is the answer the footage forces on us. We can bracket it, but we cannot stamp it. Combining the assembly sequence with the shadow angle and a same-day satellite pass, investigators can say with reasonable confidence that the completed span was exposed for at least the better part of an hour, very likely longer, between the moment it spanned the gap and the moment the coupling fault was resolved. By the standard of Bilohorivka, where the killing windows ran for hours across multiple days, that is not unusually long, and that is precisely the point. The Russian engineer doctrine for these crossings has not solved the exposure problem. It has simply continued to accept it because there is no other way to get armor across a wide river, and the alternative is to not cross at all. Now the part that will probably draw fire. The standard reading of these crossings frames the engineers as victims of better enemy reconnaissance, overwhelmed by drones, doomed by an asymmetry they could not control. We think that reading lets the planning off too easily. The vulnerability of an open pontoon crossing in a contested sector has been known in detail since the second week of May 2022. The footage we are reading shows the same doctrine, the same exposure, the same single-set crossing with no redundancy, years after the lesson was written in burned armor on the same river system. The drones did not invent this weakness. They exposed a planning choice that keeps being made, to bridge in daylight in a contested zone, on a timeline that depends on every coupling seating on the first try. That is not bad luck. That is a decision repeated, which raises a question worth sitting with and one you can actually answer. Watching a structure like this go up, knowing what happened at Bilohorivka, knowing what is almost certainly watching from altitude, would you have given the order to build it in daylight, or would you have waited for a night you might not get? There is no clean answer. That is exactly why it is worth your time in the comments. Recattention underscore checkpoint viewer question planted mid-back half. Now what does the float count actually prove about the unit, and, just as important, what does it not? This is where investigative honesty earns its keep. The floats tell you load class and river width with real confidence. The boats tell you the rough scale of the engineer effort, and on this footage the count of bridging boats working in coordinated pairs points to a substantial detachment, not a light forward team. Together those numbers bracket the kind of formation involved. A pontoon bridge engineer element of regimental support scale, operating a near-complete park at the upper edge of its load rating. That is a defensible bracket. It is not a name. The specific unit, its designation, its commander, the formation it was bridging for, is not established by the footage, and we are not going to invent it. The unit on the evidence in front of us remains unnamed. Anyone who tells you the floats produced a regiment number is selling you certainty the imagery cannot support. There is a temptation in this kind of work to make the evidence say more than it does. The discipline is to stop exactly where the picture stops. The footage gives us width, load class, detachment scale, and an exposure window with a documented fault. It does not give us a unit patch, and the difference between those two statements is the entire difference between OSINT and rumor. There is a detail in all of this that has stayed with me, and it has nothing to do with hardware. It is the rhythm of the men on the span. Watch them long enough, and you stop seeing soldiers and start seeing a work crew, the unhurried, practiced economy of people who have done this many times, who know that rushing on water gets men hurt, and who are therefore moving at exactly the speed the job demands, while a part of every one of them is listening for the thing that ends the afternoon. That tension between the patience the work requires and the speed the danger demands is in a single frame the whole impossible problem of the wet crossing. We left one thing out of this breakdown for length: the way analysts cross-check a float count against the vehicle column waiting on the approach road, because the size and type of that column can independently confirm the load class the bridge was built for. If you want that second method walked through end to end, say so, and it becomes its own investigation. Retention underscore checkpoint, engagement hook B, intentional omission. So pull the threads together. The misbehaving float was a failed coupling near the home bank, confirmed in its effect even if we cannot name its cause, and it cost the crossing its most precious resource, time, at the most dangerous possible point in the build. The float count put the river at roughly 220 meters and the bridge at the upper edge of its load rating, which means armor was the intended cargo. The boat count put a substantial engineer detachment on the water, operating a near-complete pontoon park with no visible reserve, and the exposure window, bracketed by sequence and shadow and a single satellite pass, ran long enough to matter, long enough that 4 years after Bila Harivka, the math had not changed at all. That is the resolution, and it is a sober one. The footage cannot tell us whether this particular span survived its exposure or whether it became another entry in another open-source tally. The drone broke station. The picture ends. But the bridge told us everything a bridge can tell: its width, its weight, its maker's scale, and the precise minutes it spent finished and waiting on a single bad joint with the river wide and the sky watching. Here is what one bridge tells you about the war. The decisive contest on this battlefield is not always a missile or a tank. Sometimes it is a counting game played in silence. One side laying floats as fast as hands allow, the other side reading those floats from altitude, and the winner decided by whether the bridge can open before the math is finished. Learn to read it, and a gray ribbon on brown water stops being a mystery and starts being a confession. If forensic, evidence-led breakdowns like this are the kind of thing you want more of, the next investigation reads a captured engineer manual against drone footage to show exactly how the float count method is taught from the inside, and how the people building these bridges know to the minute how long they have. That one picks up precisely where this leaves off.